All right, so we're going to be looking at factoring trinomials, and we'll be using the AC method. The AC method refers to when you write out a quadratic like this, the first coefficient is usually called A, the second coefficient is B, and the constant term at the end is called C. So this method involves using the first coefficient and the constant term, A and C. I'm choosing to use examples where the leading coefficient is not a 1. This method works just fine if the leading coefficient is a 1. Just do this, follow exactly the same procedures. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is take the first coefficient and multiply it onto or with the constant term at the end. Make sure that you include the sign. Okay, that negative is part of the constant term. Same thing would happen if my leading coefficient was a negative. I would include the sign. Okay. This little arc that I've drawn here, when I was first taught this method by one of my students actually, her teacher called it the rainbow method. And so he would draw a little rainbow to connect the first and the last, and to remind students that you need to multiply them together. So we multiply 10 times -7. Can move over here, do a little side work. So 10 times a -7 is 70, -70. So what we're going to look for are two numbers that multiply together to give me -70. If I'm multiplying and I'm supposed to get an answer of -70, then one of my numbers is going to have to be positive and one is going to have to be negative. Okay. So we're just going to keep that in mind. So what numbers can we multiply to get 70? Well, we could multiply 1 and 70. We could multiply 2 and 35. We could multiply 5 and 14. We could multiply 7 and 10. So these are the possibilities. Now what we need to do is pick the possibilities where if we add them together, we get the middle number, which is a +9. Okay, so now here's where we have to remember that to multiply these and get a -70, one number in the pair has to be positive, the other has to be negative. So could we take +70 and a -1 and add those together? Well, 70 minus 1 is 69. That's not +9. That's not going to work. But if we scan down this list, we'll get to this third pair right here. And if one of them is positive and the other is negative, then 14 minus 5 is +9, and 14 times -5 is -70. So this works. So we want to use 14 and -5. All right, so what are we going to do with these two numbers? Well, we're going to come back over here, and we are not going to factor. Instead, we're going to rewrite this. So 10x squared. But now when we get to the middle term, we're going to take this middle term and split it up into two different terms. One of them will have a coefficient of +14. The other will have a coefficient of -5. And it doesn't actually matter the order you write it in. I'm going to choose to write this as -5x plus 14x. And then we still have the -7 at the end. Right, so I didn't change the first term. We're not factoring yet. I didn't change the last term. We're not factoring yet. All we did was we rewrote this in a way that splits up the middle term into two pieces. And they both have an x on them because we need to be able to add them together to get back to the 9x. But now we have this split up into 4 pieces. And if you watched the factoring by grouping videos, you might suspect that we can now factor by grouping. So the AC method is not actually a factoring method. The AC method is a method for taking a trinomial and writing it in 4 terms so that we can now factor by grouping. If you watch the second factoring by grouping video, you might remember that there was an example where we had to shuffle the order of things. When you do this AC method, the only things you have to worry about are the middle 2 terms. But you don't have to worry about the order they go in. The first term stays in front, the last term stays in back. The middle 2 terms can be in either order, and it will work. So now, practice factoring by grouping, pause the video, factor by grouping, and your answer should be 5x plus 7 times 2x minus 1. Go ahead and try that. I'm going to move on to a second example. For the second example, that's that. There's the answer to the previous one. And so the next example, we're going to look at 6x squared minus 11xy plus 4y squared. So again, this is a trinomial, 3 terms. And we're going to try the AC method. So AC method, we want to take the first coefficient and the last coefficient, multiply them together. So 6 times 4 is 24. We're going to look for 2 numbers that multiply together to give us 24, but when we add them, we get a negative 11. How's that going to work? Well, since when we multiply and get a positive 24, that means we're either multiplying 2 positive numbers or we're multiplying 2 negative numbers. So in this case, we want to look at negative numbers because when we add them together, we want to get a negative 11. So what are the possibilities here? Well, there's 1 and 24, 2 and 12, there's 3 and 8, and there's more, but I'm going to stop because I recognize that if I have a negative 3 and a negative 8, if I multiply negative 3 times negative 8, I get a positive 24. But if I add negative 3 and negative 8, I'll get a negative 11. Okay, so that's how we're going to split up the middle term with negative 3 and negative 8. And again, the order doesn't matter. What does matter is that we make sure the variables are the same. So this middle term has a variable x times y. So the middle terms will have the same variables. All right, here we go. The 6x squared does not change. We split the middle term up into, let's just do negative 3xy minus 8xy. We could swap those two, it's fine. But again, notice they both have the same variables as the original term. It's because we want to be able to add those two together to get back to negative 11xy if we need to. If we split up the variables and only one of them had the x and the other one had the y, they would not be like terms. We couldn't add them to get back to that middle term. So we split it up, but the variables stay the same. The last term just comes down 4y squared. And now we should be ready for factoring by grouping. This one I'll go ahead and work out. So we're going to group 6x squared minus 3xy. Now remember, this is from previous video on factoring by grouping. This next term is negative. The negative needs to stay with the 8. When we put things into groups for factoring by grouping, there's always a plus sign in between the two groups. The negative goes with the 8. So negative xy plus 4y squared. Just as a reminder. All right, now we're into standard factoring by grouping. We're just going to factor the common factor out of each group individually. So looking at this first group, 6 and 3, both are divisible by 3. X squared and x, both terms have at least one x in them, so we'll pull out an x. And this second term has a y, but the first one doesn't, so we'll leave it alone. If we divide 6 by 3, we have a 2. If we divide x squared by x, we have an x. Now, remember, this is division. Negative 3 divided by 3 is negative 1. X divided by x is a 1, so that goes away. And then the y just stays there, it's left behind. Now, we don't really need to write the 1 there. So on the next line, I'm just going to write it as minus y. But for now, it works. Okay, moving on to this next one. Okay, so negative 8 and positive 4, both divisible by 4, but because this first term is negative, we're going to factor out a negative. So we're going to factor out a negative 4. I already wrote the plus sign there, so let's put it in parentheses. All right, so now division, negative 8 divided by negative 4. Oh, I forgot to factor out the y. Silly me. Forgive me. Let's drop down. All right, starting over. Here we go. We decided to factor out a negative 4. Both 8 and 4 are divisible by 4. The first term here is negative. We'll factor out a negative 4. And both terms have a y in it. We'll factor out a y. Started to do the same mistake again. All right, division then. Negative 8 divided by negative 4 is positive 2. The x doesn't have anything to divide out, but the y does. Y divided by y goes to a 1, so just the x is left over. X does not get pulled out, does not get divided out. All right, 4 divided by negative 4 is negative 1. Y squared divided by y is just y. And you can see that each group has a common factor, those parentheses. Oh, I also wanted to point out, just again as a reminder, since our leading in this group, since our leading term had a negative, we factored out that negative. What we factored out was negative. All right, so now we factor out the common factor, 2x minus y. In the first group, if we divide out the 2x minus y, the 3x is what remains. In the second group, if we factor out the 2x minus y, the minus 4y is what remains. And this is our factored form.